Alexia, given the group of people here, what do you think about us sharing that conversation here instead of doing breakout rooms? You feeling good about that?
I think, yes, I'm feeling good about that.
Cool. Well, then let me introduce our moderator and our presenter for today. Alexia is the executive director of the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, a national organization that protects the rights of farmers and consumers to engage in direct commerce. The organization provides legal representation to small independent farmers and food producers and works to change policy to support small producers. Alexia has practiced law for 25 years and holds an advanced law degree in food and agriculture law. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you so much for having me at this exciting conference virtually, and that folks can join from, it looks like, many different places. So I appreciate that. Thanks for having me. As Sophie said, I'm Alexia, and I'm with Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. I am physically at the moment in Wisconsin. I also do some work at the University of Wisconsin, thus there is a Bucky Badger behind me. I am in a borrowed office today, but it's been bugging me, so I thought I'd point it out so that folks just knew what the heck was going on back there. And Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, I'll just say, and then we'll get into a discussion before I begin presenting, which is, but I would just like to say we're a member-based organization providing legal representation to small farms. So when we are getting into regulatory problems with state agencies, federal agencies, helping folks draw contracts or agreements to try to get around some of those problems, a little bit of litigation and a lot of consultation. So yeah, we're national, and I think we have a few folks in Alabama, but really happy to be here with you all. So thank you. So Sophie, I think we were going to just get started with a discussion with everyone, and that is, before I jump into presenting things, I'm curious what kind of experiences or challenges you folks have faced in government regulation, right? I mean, we all know, I think a lot of policy and regulation has been created with the larger farms in mind. And so my question to you all is what roadblocks or challenges have you as smaller or more mid-sized farms faced with government regulation? And this is a pretty easy, good-sized group. So as far as I'm concerned, folks throughout the conversation and the presentation, feel free to unmute yourselves and just throw it out there. And Sophie, I see, has put the question in the chat. Have you had any challenges with government regulation or roadblocks? Has it all been easy peasy? You've had absolutely no problems? If so, I want to know exactly where you live and where you're farming.
Hey, my name is Kirk Creel. I'm in Shelby County, Alabama, and we are actually currently doing cut flowers. We moved from vegetables and eggs into cut flowers because that was a viable market for us. But I've been in the food industry prior to that, and as well as growing vegetables. And I've just recognized that a lot of the food safety standards aren't really meant for a local food production. I mean, yes, we want clean and fresh food that people aren't going to get sick when they eat it. I mean, there's some common sense things you really need to do, but the overall regulations that are applied aren't conducive to a small farm, that, from what I've experienced. And and I guess that's what I've seen.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else want to chime in with experiences?
I'm Natalie with the Farm Food Collaborative. We work with a bunch of different sized farms, and I think, like what Kirk was saying, it's not really the food safety aspect is not really equitable for some smaller farms, because to sell into any larger, like even as a local example to sell into the Piggly Wiggly stores, they did this big promotion where they partnered with Sweet Grown Alabama, our state brand, and they were trying to get more locally grown foods into the grocery stores. But in order to participate, you had to be GAP certified.
Right.
Or at least that was their preference that they were telling people. So that was, GAP certification is a very labor intensive process, a very expensive process. And it just didn't make sense if you're just trying to sell some stuff for a season to some stores and it may not last past that season. There's not a lot of value in spending your time and money getting that certification. So it's a big barrier for a lot of smaller producers.
Sure, absolutely. And the irony, some of these smaller producers really would be the best ones to providing these products. And then these policies that come into place make it difficult to do that, right? And certainly with food safety as well, I would say it seems that policy is very much aimed at taking measures to make sure that food that's not necessarily grown safely is safe, instead of making sure that it's produced safely, right? Like taking actions to make something safe. Whereas if you had just done it right from the get-go, you wouldn't have those concerns. Who else has experienced any kind of challenges with regulation of, and sure, it can be any size, although I can certainly speak more, our experiences are more with smaller and mid-sized farms, but any other concerns, challenges folks would like to share?
I had something to add to that, was that it doesn't seem like, from my experience in previous jobs, it doesn't seem like the retail side is actually held to the same standard as the farm. And the distribution center, well, the distribution centers are to an extent, but further, you know, the retail side isn't where the food could be most damaged and the most, and create the most issues, especially in freezing and refrigeration. There's no, those policies don't go to the retail end as they do for everybody else.
Yes, and production does seem to be where the strongest focus is, for sure. I would agree with that.
Now, I'll just add to that there's, because of our fractured food regulation system, whether it's FDA or USDA or local health department or state, you know, ADAI or state health department, it adds a lot of confusion to what are the rules and who's regulating whom.
Right. Yeah, there is definitely a lot of confusion around this. All right. Anyone else want to add something into the mix here? Otherwise, we'll get started and try to talk about some of these thorny issues. Anyone else? It's a great picture, Kristen. Anyone else have anything? Okay, well, yeah, these are some of the things that I really wanted to get into today, right? And start just talking about the issues that smaller producers face, and specifically having to worry about, like Kristen mentioned, you know, you might have a very small operation and be concerned with federal law, state law, county, township ordinances, and it really can be a lot for just a small producer. So with that, I am going to share my screen and move my head so I can start this slideshow. All right, can you all see a slideshow here? Great, thank you for that. Okay. Trying to find, there we go. Okay, wonderful. So yeah, we've done our introduction, so we can just jump right into this. So one thing that I would just, the first couple of slides, one thing I just wanted to get into here was to talk about some of the major regulations that can be difficult. And so one thing I'll just say in terms of smaller farms is, a lot of times what has made it so difficult for your small producers and small farms? We've seen the impact of consolidation. I know a lot of smaller farms don't participate in any of the farm bill programs, so they're at a disadvantage from the get-go to some extent. Obviously, all farms are seeing the impact of climate change, which can be traced back to particular federal and state regulations as well. I know we've had producers struggle with some of the country of origin labeling, struggle sometimes with export markets, although that's not so much for the smallest farms. And then really, and here's where I'll probably spend a little bit more time, is difficulty in dealing with or handling the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, regulation by FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, maybe conservation, and a myriad, a lot more, wow, this is jumping all around on me, sorry, of other state and federal regulations, right? So I often like to start out by just sort of pointing out, so you could be a small farm, maybe about 10 acres, you've got you're raising laying hens, livestock, maybe, a couple of animals for slaughter, maybe you're trying to do dairy. I'm not sure if I mentioned vegetables and maybe some value added products, but you're talking about, a small operation, doing things organically, growing in a sustainable nature, which I know most of the folks in your organization here are. So it feels like this really shouldn't be all that complicated, right? And unfortunately, while it maybe shouldn't be, I'm not going to go through this slide. I purposefully made it really too many words because the bottom line here is that, in fact, it is too much, right? Just that small farm that's dealing with the couple of items that I mentioned will deal with all sorts of, and these are just federal laws to understand if you're going to be a small farmer. And of course, there's a host of state law and regulations as well that come into play. So, and by the way, I'm just going to say that I cannot, now that I'm sharing, I can't see anybody or see the chat. So I'm just going to keep rolling with it, but please just jump in and ask a question or make a comment as you'd like. I just wanted to be clear about that. Otherwise I can keep going here for a minute. So like I said, and what we'll do is pick out a couple of the, what I think are the most troubling and difficult pieces of federal legislation, but that slide indicated that there's a whole host of federal laws that sometimes we need to worry about. And then at the state level, we're more likely to see some of these issues arise. You might have a lot of zoning issues. There might be issues about commercial sales of products directly from your farm. Meat and poultry processing, we'll talk about that. Potential regulations of raw dairy. Sometimes the health department gets involved, and sometimes you've got municipal ordinances regarding noise or odors, particularly in these areas that are exurban, right? That potentially used to be more agricultural lands, and more people have been moving to the area and then not wanting any of the inconveniences as they see it of having farms nearby. Although of course they're going to want your farm products. We'll touch a little bit on cottage food laws and potentially state and local egg regulation. So again, we have several different levels of state regulation, federal and county. There may be different licensing requirements that you have to worry about. And sometimes we can fight some of those with local right to farm laws, but sometimes those are pretty narrowly written, so a little bit more complicated. So what I'd like to do now is, that's just sort of my introduction of, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful for our small producers and everything that they're contributing. And we all know that consumers want your products. Consumers want locally grown, locally produced, healthy produced food, and then for you to sell that, say, directly from your farm or to farmers market, or sometimes in that retail sector, gets really complicated. And so my organization, that's what we do, is try to help farmers through those regulations. So I'll touch on a few that our members struggle with a lot, and welcome comments, suggestions, or questions as we go along, and we'll certainly leave time at the end as well. So I'll start here with this is the statute that I would say our members are struggling with the most at the moment. This is the Federal Meat Inspection Act, and what it requires is that every time livestock is slaughtered for human consumption, is that it be done so in a federal inspected facility or a USDA slaughterhouse, or a state inspected facility with requirements that are equal to or greater than the federal law. So to be able to sell meat, you need to have that meat slaughtered and processed at an inspection facility that's been licensed and regulated by the USDA or by your state. And where that gets particularly troubling is, and I'd love if folks want to like just chime in on the chat or something, or even say something, but I know that with our members at Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, that all sounds fine and good, but these facilities are often very far from where you're producing. Those of you that are raising livestock in a holistic manner in accordance with certain animal welfare standards, you know, you raise them well and have them grass fed and pasture, and then have to drive them 400 miles to an inspection facility. You really kind of undo some of those benefits, right, through stress to the animal and problems. But the bigger problems that our members are currently facing in this area, and I'm sure that you are, is that you simply can't even get the appointments to have animals slaughtered at a USDA or a state inspected facility. And so, you know, we're getting appointments out a couple of years out at this point, is what I'm seeing as common. And for a small producer that has to maintain and care for the animal prior to slaughter and processing, that's simply not economically feasible. So this policy is really driving people away from being able to raise livestock as a small producer and sell it. So one thing that we have seen as a solution to that, which I'll get into, is the custom slaughter exemption. This allows smaller producers to sell live animals or shares in live animals directly to a new owner, and then bringing that animal to a custom slaughter facility for slaughter and processing, and then providing the meat directly to the consumer, rather than it be considered a sale of the meat. So this is becoming, I would say, much more and more common today. So in Alabama, and by the way, if there's someone here worrying about state law other than Alabama, I think I saw someone in the chat from California. Please let me know and jump in. I mean, I don't know them all super well off the top of my head, but I'll do my best. Which is another frustrating area of this law, is that there's so many state-driven policies that it makes it even more challenging. In any case, in Alabama, the state follows the USDA rules for the exemptions to the Federal Meat Inspection Act. So I mentioned the law requires inspection facilities. I tend to operate more under the exemptions to this requirement. And the two important exemptions that we work with our members on a regular basis are the personal exemption and the custom slaughter exemption. Under the personal exemption, a processor can slaughter and process livestock for themselves and their families. A quote new owner, in other words, a customer or a consumer who wants to purchase animals, can do so, purchase it directly from a producer, and then slaughter and process on the producer's farm with the producer's tools and equipment, and use the personal exemption for their own method of obtaining the fresh meat for their own personal use and that of their family. Unfortunately, the tricky thing there is the new owner would have to be doing the activities of slaughter and processing, and once the producer is helping those folks, now it's no longer the personal exemption, and the producer would have to be a custom slaughter exemption facility. So I've always thought that's a little strange, given that the professional is probably the one that would be in a better position to slaughter and process any live animals that were sold. But in any case, that does lead us to the custom slaughter exemption. So that is allowed in Alabama, meaning that a livestock producer can in fact sell a live animal or shares in a live animal, bring the animal to the custom slaughter facility, often a lot closer, and then that facility may process the animal for the end consumer who gets product from their own animal, right? So it's not a sale at this point. They bought a live animal and are having it processed by the processor for their own use. So that's considered the custom slaughter exemption and perfectly lawful in Alabama. These custom slaughter facilities are regulated by USDA. The real main difference between a custom slaughter facility and a USDA facility is that there is not an on-site in-person inspector present for the slaughter and process of every animal. But in terms of conditions and safety precautions and sanitary conditions, all of those regulations in custom slaughter facilities are still in play. And in Alabama, these facilities do in fact need to register with the Alabama Department of Agriculture and are subject to periodic inspection. So what I'll just say as an organization, what that means is that we will help members facilitate those kinds of sales and delivery of meat products to avoid having meat that has not been slaughtered pursuant to the Federal Meat Inspection Act. It's a way of not having to find an inspected facility to then sell your meat products. Okay, so turning to the Poultry Products Inspection Act. Although, again, given the size of our crowd today, if anybody wants to chime in with questions or comments, again, feel free. Another common law that I'm dealing with our members on a regular basis is the Poultry Products Inspection Act. This is pretty similar to the Federal Meat Inspection Act in that, in general terms, it is requiring poultry that is to be sold to an end consumer to be slaughtered and processed at a federal inspection facility or again at a state facility. So again, for larger producers, they have to bring the animals to an inspection facility for slaughter and processing and can then sell the meat from the poultry that has been processed. What's interesting about the Poultry Products Inspection Act is that it does allow for some exemptions for the smaller farmers. So under the federal law, what the USDA says is that states can adopt either or both a federal exemption that regulates slaughter and processing of poultry if you raise 1,000 or less birds or under 20,000 birds. And Alabama has in fact adopted the federal exemptions. So what that means is that in Alabama, producers of poultry can raise their own birds, their own poultry. They can slaughter and process those birds, and they can sell the meat directly to an end consumer on farm or at farmers markets, right? So as long as they're under 1,000 birds or under 20,000 birds, that is the case. Okay, so what that, so you say, well, why is there both 1,000 and a 20,000 bird exemption? That's kind of an interesting way to put it, right? And the bottom line is that you are exempt from the Poultry Products Processing Inspection Act if you sell less than 1,000 birds, and then there's one set of regulations for that. If you're selling between 1,000 and 20,000 birds, then there's a different set of details, neither of which are really necessarily all that difficult to overcome. So for example, with the 1,000 bird exemption, a producer can operate under this exemption, process the birds and sell the meat from the birds as long as it's under 1,000 birds. The producer can't be buying or selling another producer's poultry and then selling that. They have to just be working with the animals that they have raised. There's certain sanitary standards and practices. Producers need to keep copies of records, and these products can only be sold on an intrastate basis. So within your state, most of you within the state of Alabama, for example. Under the 20,000 bird exemptions, there's just a few more details in terms of the regulations that are in place, right? So still you're dealing with your own poultry produced on the farm. It's still intrastate. And there's just a couple of additional regulations included, that poultry are healthy when they're slaughtered. Again, sanitary standards will be in place. The poultry is only produced under this exemption. In other words, the producer isn't operating under several exemptions at the same time. The facility is not going to be used to slaughter another person's poultry. So if you're under 1,000 birds, you can have another producer come and use your equipment and process on your farm. That's not going to be the case under the 20,000 bird exemption. And then finally, you do need to label your products with, the producer's name and address, and the statement that the food was produced exempt Public Law 9492. So that's notifying the end consumer that it hasn't been brought to a USDA or a state inspection facility. So we do see a lot of smaller farms utilize the poultry processing exemption to raise meat birds and to be able to sell that meat from the products. Okay, another area in which I see smaller farms sometimes struggling, and one of you sort of mentioned this in the beginning already, is the regulation of eggs, right? So on a larger scale, the federal egg safety rule has a lot of very detailed regulations in place. If you are raising 3,000 or more hens, laying hens at a given time. So that's going to regulate sanitation, refrigeration, all kinds of details in terms of the regulation of production and sale of eggs. In Alabama, you do need a permit to sell retail, but you can sell on farm without having to meet all of the federal egg safety rules, as long as you have a label stating the name and address of the producer rather, and the size of egg. You can sell that both retail and on farm. Now, I think in some places, certain farmers markets have their own specific requirements and specifications, and certain townships and counties may also have additional regulations. But typically, as long as you're under that 3,000 hen rule, in Alabama, you are able to sell ungraded eggs directly from the farm to the consumer. Another issue that a lot of our members tend to deal with is dairy. So at the federal level, of course, dairy is really regulated by the federal pasteurized milk ordinance. Federal law prohibits interstate sales of any non-pasteurized milk. So you cannot produce any raw milk or raw milk product and sell it across any state lines. So because that's the way the federal law is written, it leaves regulation of raw milk and raw milk products or dairy products really up to the states. So we'll take a couple of moments. I am curious if anybody here on the call is doing raw dairy, but so feel free to share if you are. But in any case, Alabama is one of our more positive states in terms of your ability to produce and sell raw dairy. Earlier on, someone was raising the issues of potential safety concerns, of course, with some of the regulations of smaller producers. Alabama, that's the rationale for some of the prohibitions on raw dairy. Alabama does allow selling raw goat, and that should be cow's milk, on farm if less than 500 gallons per month. So the Arkansas statute allows for smaller producers to produce and sell raw milk. And in my mind, this kind of goes at what we were talking about a little bit at the very beginning of this session, which is a smaller producer is probably in a better position to ensure that it's producing in a safe fashion from the get-go, right? Raising the animals in safe conditions, making sure that there's no debris or problems that the animals are getting into, which is what's going to cause most of the problems in milk produced by the animals. Some states completely prohibit the sales of raw milk, and some states have a stronger permitting or licensing system for raw milk at the intrastate level. So in Alabama, it's based on volume, and again, you're limited to sell the product within the state lines. One thing we do at Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund when it comes to raw dairy, and I suppose I should touch on this, we're starting to do more of that with meat as well, is help members with herd share agreements. And I'm sure some of you have heard of this, right? But it's when you're actually selling a share in an animal or in the herd. And then when it comes time for milking and to receive the milk or milk products, now as an owner, as a part owner of that herd, I have a right to that herd's milk production, and it's not a sale, it's based on percentage. So I then get a percentage of that milk production as a co-owner or as a share owner in that herd. And we're starting to see some of that be done with meat production as well. Okay, any questions, comments on what we've covered so far? I don't know who's in the room. I know that it's a sustainable ag conference, so there may be more vegetable growers here than there are livestock or dairy. But I do like to start out with those. Those are items that our members are pretty consistently dealing with on a regular basis. So another important one that's really, I think, recognized as relevant to smaller and mid-sized farms is the Food Safety Modernization Act. And as I'm sure as many of you realize, there's a lot of different aspects to FSMA, one of them being the produce safety rule. And so one thing about FSMA that I find interesting is that while it had a graduated system in terms of when a smaller farm would be covered by the law, it doesn't have very much, it does not exempt smaller farms very much today from the requirements of the statute itself. It provided smaller farms more time to become in compliance with the laws, but even smaller farms are now, for the most part, covered by the FSMA produce safety rule and need to be aware of that in producing vegetables on your small farms, right? So a couple of the high points of things that FSMA covers are regulations concerning training personnel who harvest and handle the produce, making sure that you have hygienic practices involved in the farm, reviewing with your staff members, right, watching for any kind of potential contaminants, making sure folks are washing their hands after handling any kind of contaminants, making sure that there's no animals and animal residue or excretion in the area where your vegetables are being grown, right? Other requirements are going to talk about what kind of manure, what kind of practices to prevent contamination, having your FSMA regulated products separate from non-covered. So if you're keeping some for your own livelihoods, or I'm sorry, for your own personal use, or for local sales as opposed to interstate commerce, you can separate out those crops for purposes of FSMA. Pretty detailed record requirements about what was grown where, and where your products are sold is required by FSMA, and this is again a safety issue so that authorities can then track where a problem stems from. Well, you know, with the smaller farm selling directly from their farm to a consumer, you know, there already is this idea that they keep sales records. They know who they've sold to. Consumers know where they've purchased the product. It hasn't gone through 3 middle people before landing on the retail store shelf. But even smaller farms are kept to the standard of keeping pretty detailed records about precisely where the crops were, precisely how they were treated to prevent contamination, and then who sales have been made to. So record keeping is awfully important in this. My apologies. Yeah, and then there are some rules, of course, related to soil amendments, to sprouts, and to animals. And water testing at this point is now going to apply to small businesses just as much as mid-sized or larger businesses. So if you're growing vegetables, the Food Safety Modernization Act is also going to be very relevant and important to your practice. There's also something under the Food Safety Modernization Act known as the Preventive Controls Rules. This is to some extent similar to what we talked about in the produce safety rule, but it has requirements about employees being qualified to perform particular duties, specifies certain training and experience that have to take place, does set some generally acceptable practices concerning allergens, cross-contact, provisions for distribution by products, and having a food safety plan. So some farms are exempt from the preventive controls, but they would be pretty small farms at this point in time. So having these for vegetable growers, having preventive controls and food safety plans in place is very important. One thing I just wanted to let folks know has been discussed, and this has not been passed. But one thing that tends to happen under federal law is there's the statute itself, and then you have a government agency decide that it's going to promulgate rules and regulations that get much more specific, interpreting that act. And so one of those things at the FDA, there had been discussion of regulations that further define and further interpret the Food Safety Modernization Act. And the agency had made a host of proposals as to narrowing down or interpreting the Food Safety Modernization Act. And a couple of these make sense, and a couple of these I think really I find troubling for the smaller producers. So identify preserved foods that are packaged on the farm have to be individually packaged and labeled. So again, I'm not entirely sure what the FDA had in mind here, but for a small sustainable farmer, you're not going to want to be necessarily doing that kind of thing. Keeping records in spreadsheets as to where all crops are that you can provide to the FDA in a particular format within 24 hours has been suggested and recommended. And my favorite here is keeping GPS coordinates of where crops are located so that the FDA has access to that at any given time. Now, again, smaller farms, that's not going to be real useful. Maybe you do, and maybe you don't have great access to internet. Hopefully those are on the line too. But a lot of folks still in agricultural areas don't have that access. But more importantly, with the way that you're doing crop rotations, the GPS coordinates are going to be changing on a regular basis, and having to use that kind of technology to keep track of the crops really doesn't make sense for a small farmer rotating crops. It certainly makes sense for the commodity crop farmer or these large farms that are doing monocrops of commodity crops on a regular basis. But I would say for a small vegetable grower, that just really doesn't make sense. Okay. One other thing that this is livestock and not vegetables, but I do like to point out things that are being discussed at the national level. And here, one thing in livestock that is being discussed is the proposed RFID card. So it's an electronic identification card, as opposed to having to use the tags that have been provided by state veterinarians for many decades. Having this electronic identification is one thing that had been proposed by the USDA. The rule was pulled, it was not passed, but then they have said that this may still be something coming, right? So we might see some small exemptions there. I wanted to, and I think I've lost it, check in with the chat on exemptions under FSMA. I saw something that may have clarified something that I had on there. I can't. Yeah,
and I can clarify that if you want. I just wanted to
Sure.
make sure that everybody is aware of the exemptions under the produce safety rule. There's a great local foods exemption that allows farms up to $560,000 in food sales to be exempt from the produce safety rule. And then on the processor side, it's 1 million.
It's still under, so if you are growing under 500,000,
560,000 in all food sales, but not
Okay.
just the produce, but any other food that producing as well.
right, that you're then exempt from the food
Yeah.
safety. the produce safety rule. I
Yeah.
thought that had gone down, so that's great to hear that's still that high. Good.
Yeah, and I don't know what's going on with the traceability rule, but I hope that they carry those exemptions over into the traceability rule as well.
Right. Yeah, I would hope so as well, because it would be quite a burden on a lot of people if we had to face that. So thank you for that, Kristen. I saw the chat come up and then it went away. So a little bit technology challenged here. Thank you for that. I was then going to talk about it. And Alabama does have a new cottage food regulation, but I kind of want to stop for a minute and see if anybody else, do we have mostly vegetable growers here? I'm wondering if we should have further discussion on some of the requirements or issues that you may be facing on a regular basis here.
I would like to hear your input on that, because we, prior to what we do now, we did some baked goods and things like that. And now with the added value, and that's a big thing for farmers, is trying to create an added value product that they can make, they can get a little more added value to. So, and it seems to me that a lot of the added value beyond the cottage food law, and if there's certain items like salsa or acid containing things or anything outside baking, you have to go to a commercial kitchen and make. And that seems to be kind of a barrier to a small farm or somebody who's not a larger producer.
Right. Yeah, this has become, I think, a very important area of regulation in the last several years, is what we call cottage food regulations, right? And so just as I think it was Kirk just mentioned, a lot of farms are able to supplement their income by offering value-added food or food produced on the farm. Now, most locations, if you are going to produce food and sell the food, then your local township or your local health department may require that you use a commercial kitchen, get a particular kind of permit, and that obviously is not going to be necessarily economically viable for a small farm. So we've seen states begin to pass cottage food regulations that allows for some sale of added value products without needing that commercial kitchen and without needing some sort of commercial sales license. So prior to this year, what I can say about Alabama is that the law did permit certain non-perishable items to be sold at farmers markets only, and there had been a limit up to $20,000 of revenue from these kinds of non-perishable items. The items were more limited under the law prior to 2021. But this year, Alabama did pass a new cottage food law amendment that strengthened and broadened the Alabama cottage food law. So now, under Alabama's law, you can produce a good number of non-perishable items in your home kitchen. Now you can sell it directly from the farm as opposed to just farmers markets. Now you can sell it in addition at farmers markets, and the sales limit of up to $20,000 has been removed. The number or the kinds of foods that can be produced under the cottage food law has now increased significantly as well. So anything, I mean, the easy way to think about what's permitted is what's shelf stable, right? If it's non-perishable. And so the law does talk about breads and pastries and dried goods, like dried fruits, that kind of thing. It does say that you cannot produce perishable baked goods, but it does specifically say that you can produce and sell breads, pastries, and dried goods. The law says that you can sell pickled products, fermented foods, jams and preserves, a lot of baked goods that don't have ingredients in them that make them more subject to perishability, right? Like they don't have a dairy custard, for example, something like that. You can't do low acid canned foods or juices or meat jerkies. But you can do an awful lot more in Alabama than you could prior to this year. You can sell from the farm, you can ship, which you weren't allowed to do prior, and you can also have somebody, hire somebody, frankly, to deliver products for the customers. You do have to, in order to be producing under the local cottage food amendments, there is a safety course that's required by the state and approved by your local health department. So, I mean, I know I'm not that familiar with the Alabama course itself, but I know in a lot of states they're offered virtually these days, and they're really not necessarily that difficult. Some pretty self-explanatory issues in terms of food safety are addressed, but it's not necessarily a very difficult thing to obtain. So for Alabama, I thought this was actually a very good amendment and really a nice move in terms of being able to produce cottage food directly in your farm kitchens or your home kitchens and sell it directly to producers. Have folks had any experience yet with the Alabama cottage food laws? This sounds like a helpful change to me. I'm just kind of curious. You're revising the course. Excellent. Any other comments on the Alabama cottage food law? I think a lot of times when I'm working with smaller farmers, as I think Kirk mentioned, it's difficult. Small, low volume vegetable sales, for example, maybe some dairy, it's pretty difficult to really make ends meet doing that kind of farming. So this value added has been a real help, I think, to a lot of smaller farms. Another area that has been of real help to smaller farms has been agritourism laws, which I'm also more than happy to discuss if anybody is interested. But in any case, we are seeing changes to the cottage food laws here in Alabama. So here I've listed what I do consider as some of the most relevant federal laws to smaller or mid-sized farms. You've got the Food Safety Modernization Act, which for our members, what I have seen it be most relevant to is the produce safety rule that Kristen mentioned. I think important to smaller farmers are the Federal Meat Inspection Act, but more importantly, the exemptions to that act, which is the personal use exemption and custom slaughter exemption. Similarly, it's important to understand the Poultry Processing Act and the exemptions to that. That's an area under state law that smaller producers can really take advantage of. We're seeing some things being proposed in terms of animal tags and in terms of some amendments to the Packers and Stockyards Act that's most specifically to large poultry contract farmers that I have been following in any case, but can certainly influence some of the smaller contract poultry farmers as well. Again, influencing small farms might be dairy regulations, and your local egg regulations are things that will be addressed as well. Before I move on, what I will say in terms of state law regulations, other things that I think really do come into play on a regular basis are what you can do on your farm based on the zoning. So very often having that land zoned as in farming on land that is in fact agricultural land is really of the utmost importance. And then just as a typical matter, it impacts your tax liabilities, and it will also impact your ability to construct new structures on the land, some of which you may not need permits for in a way that if you were just owning residential property in another area, you may in fact need those permits. But again, if you are doing some construction, certain permitting issues can certainly come into play. Other things that can come into play for your smaller farm might be sales licenses or licenses for retail establishments. So I'll be curious, I don't know details on this in Alabama, but I can certainly say that many places you're perfectly, you're following the rules and you can produce the the products and you could bring them, say, to a farmer's market and sell your products. But when you start selling directly from the farm, sometimes you might need to get some sort of a retail food establishment license or a commercial sales license. These are things that smaller farms sometimes need to be on the lookout for. And to someone's point, really early on, there's just too many agencies involved for folks to be able to even figure out where they need to do and what they need to worry about. I think that your state Department of Agriculture is usually going to be, for most smaller farmers, one of the most important places to think about and worry about. If you are doing meat processing, the local Department of Health is also going to be an agency that will be quite interesting or necessary for smaller farmers to know about. So I thought I would just touch on a couple of other pieces of legislation in other parts of the country that are being discussed. So there are certainly folks that talk about not just cottage food laws and cottage food regulations, but what's being referred to as food freedom laws or food sovereignty laws. And typically, at least in my mind, the difference between these two is that these food freedom laws or food sovereignty laws tend to go further than your cottage food regulation. So cottage food regulation is really something that allows for smaller farmers to produce foods without a commercial kitchen license and then sell value-added products to their consumers. Food freedom or food sovereignty laws are really in play, starting to be discussed at the state level in as many different variables as possible to make it easier for the smaller farm to simply be able to produce food and sell it directly to the consumer. So the first and probably strongest of these laws that we've seen was in Wyoming. So essentially, homemade food can be sold directly to the consumer without any kind of licensing or regulation. The initial exemptions to this really were for meat and dairy. And so it did not really get into the issue of perishable and non-perishable foods from the cottage food regulation standpoint. In 2020, the state passed a law that allows for on-farm processing and specifically allows for these kind of meat share agreements where consumers can own a share in a herd and then obtain from the producer meat from that herd under their boarding agreements with the producer. This is probably one of the furthest sovereignty laws that has been passed in the country. I will mention, and I'm sure this is on another slide, but we've seen similar laws now being introduced and passed. A similar meat share law in Colorado and in Nebraska were passed this year. What I think is most interesting about these laws is there's nothing prohibiting, even without these laws, there's never been anything prohibiting the sale of live animals and then bringing those animals to custom slaughter facilities for slaughter and processing. What we have seen is some local departments of agriculture suggest that you can't take that a step further and have more than one owner take advantage of that together, say sharing an animal or sharing a herd, and then engaging in custom slaughter processing. That's not prohibited anywhere under federal law. In some states have prohibited that, but the states that are passing these laws really theoretically didn't have to do that. In other words, there was nothing stopping people from having multiple owners of one herd for purposes of meat processing. But what these state legislatures have said is, well, it may not be prohibited, but we're having different inspectors are interpreting the act differently. And that causes a lot of problems for people. And so we just want to make it crystal clear. So I think it's interesting that we've started to see more of these laws being passed. Like I say, we've seen it, Colorado and Nebraska. Utah has a very strong cottage food law allowing for just about any homemade product to be sold directly to the consumer other than meat and raw dairy with signage to inform a customer that products have not been inspected or regulated. Montana this year adopted the 1,000 poultry bird exemption. So under that federal rule, states can adopt the rule or not adopt the rule. right? So another thing for some states is pushing to allow folks to operate under the federal poultry exemptions. So that was an important move in Montana, as well as allowing for the sale of raw milk as long as the small dairy has no more than 10 lactating goats or 5 lactating cows or 10 lactating sheep. So that was a change in Montana. I've touched on the meat bills here in Colorado and Nebraska, allowing for some kind of meat share arrangements to be in place. I thought that I would mention, I don't know if y'all noticed this, but I thought this was an interesting development in the state of Maine, that they just passed in a ballot initiative early in November, so early last month, to add to their state constitution a food sovereignty amendment to the state constitution. And this amendment says that all individuals, I won't read you the entire quote here, but basically, right, have a natural inherent right to grow and produce and consume the food of their choice. You'll notice the quote here up on your screen gets into the right to save and exchange seeds. So I think we all have an idea where that may have come from, but the idea here being that states and local governments have gone so far in terms of regulating as to suggest that I own my own property, I can't raise my own food and necessarily consume that food in the way that I would like, that it's been so regulated beyond that ability. And so I think this is an interesting, an interesting development. I'm sure we'll see probably some litigation under it, but the state is essentially embracing the idea of food sovereignty and saying I should be able to raise food the way I want to, and then to consume that food the way I want to. Now, then what that gets into in terms of selling that food, we'll still see, I think, some regulations come into enforcement there. So those are really the central the central things that I really wanted to touch on, and what I'd like to figure out here, there we go, like to stop share since I couldn't see any of you, and it's much easier for me to sort of have more of a back and forth discussion or to discuss some of these things if I can see you. So I'd love to open it up and see which things people would like to dig deeper into or get into a little bit more details on.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
And maybe I can pose this to Kristen as well, if that's something that you're comfortable with. If you are finding roadblocks, or if you are struggling with the Department of Agriculture to find information, is there a place that you recommend starting with trying to kind of weed through all of that challenge?
Yeah, well, I'm sure I probably should let Kristen answer first. I mean, what I think is, I will say your local extension agents and the local Department of Agriculture are often a very good place to start. Kristen, do you want to speak? And then I do want to say something else, but I'm just kind of thinking she may want to speak to it.
Yeah, sure. It's my area of expertise is food regulation. So anybody on the call is welcome to call me if they get lost in the weeds on all of this. But we also have a team of 9 extension agents around the state that might be more local, that are very knowledgeable on state regulations as well. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing I will add, probably not surprisingly, right, is that Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund for farmer membership is $125 a year. And with that membership will come consultation, but also legal representation if there are problems. So that is something, and it's hard to do a presentation on because it can vary so much from county to county and township to township, right? But it is something that we will dig into and sort of help folks through. I know that, my experience with local extension has been fantastic, although, you do sometimes see differing interpretations. And I think that you do also sometimes see some, how shall I say, you can get angry at me if you'd like, Kristen, but sort of, our organization might help folks find a way around certain requirements if in a lawful way. I want to be crystal clear about that, right? And I think so if you're trying to do something that you're struggling with finding a way to do it lawfully, I think that our organization also could be very helpful in that, instead of just necessarily going to the local agency, because they will always want you to toe the line, and it is not always possible, right? I mean, like, meeting some of the permitting regulations for certain things can really be cost prohibitive.
In Alabama, we try to stay very clear that we're
Yeah.
not a regulatory agency. We are here to promote and support food businesses.
Right.
And
Yeah.
farming. Yeah.
Like I say, we're national, and so it's been in different places, it's different, and yeah, I always that's great. That's good to hear. So yeah, what other specific, what are people struggling with the most? I didn't know what I wanted to really dig into and with more detail. I'm seeing a question here. That says the regulation ensuring in any form priority of Alabama's local production on production from other regions. Regulation rules in it.
I think he's asking if the regulations are designed in order to promote lifting up local production over out-of-state production. Is that right? Well,
I don't know that I am not familiar with the law in Alabama that necessarily does that. There are some procurement laws, right, that would support local production over out-of-state or out-of-region production, certainly. And it's really what I've seen is what someone mentioned in the beginning of the session, really, is that, folks want this local food, but then to sell it, there could be so many problems with, like, a commercial sales license or a retail food establishment license, that kind of thing. And so I think the policies aren't really there yet to necessarily support that kind of priority, right? Let's see. All right, I'm just looking in the chat now myself. I think I had prepared for a slightly shorter session than I thought that we had. So yeah, questions on any of these? Do we have any livestock producers, any poultry producers on the line here? Kristen? Yeah, any issues, or what have the experiences been in Alabama on this?
Sure. I like you were talking about accessing processing, definitely an issue, like to the point where it's just not cost feasible for me to take an animal to an inspected facility and then try to sell the meat. It adds too much to the cost of the product. So.
Right. I'm just curious if you have used or tried the custom slaughter solution in any way.
I can't resell it. I can't sell the meat.
No. Yeah. So when you do custom slaughter, though, if you sell the animal or a share in the animal, and then they can take the processed meat from the facility, and it's not a sales meat, it's their product.
I haven't had a buyer. I would do that, but I haven't had a buyer interested in that yet.
Yeah, I think it's something that we have seen some. I've also seen in certain states are starting to support the use of mobile processing facilities that can travel from place to place, which would be interesting. And we've certainly seen some legislation providing some grants and funding to build onto or create new facilities, but those will be years in the making. And so they're not really going to help our small producers yet. So I'm just going to kind of go through the sort of subject matters. Kirk, did you have something?
Yes, ma'am. So the laws that you showed us from Montana and those areas, how many years was it in the process? Like, when did they start trying to get those laws passed? Because, man, and it goes to the broader idea of who should we go to in Alabama, or do you have suggestions about how to start that process? in Alabama to get laws like that enacted?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, what I would say is first and foremost, and I'm not as familiar with policy organizations in Alabama, but we'd be happy to be involved in such a thing. I think what really helps is if a group of people can come together and begin working on a potential policy change like that. So for example, and maybe I don't have my contact info in here. I will put it in the chat for folks if you did want to reach out. As far as how long, like the Wyoming bill, the initial food freedom bill, I think took several years of work in policy. But the amendments, the individual amendments that we saw for meat in 2020, and then an amendment again in 21, that basically says do anything you can under federal law. It's kind of the 2021 amendment in Wyoming, as far as I can read it. That also, I don't think took an awfully long time, but that's probably because of the several years put into the original statute that was passed. Colorado and Nebraska, honestly, I think they got on the bandwagon pretty quickly after we saw slaughterhouses closing down during COVID-19. So I think, we had this very vulnerable system, and I'm sure folks doing livestock can attest to the fact that the system had this problem of having a trouble getting your animals to the facilities being far away. Those problems existed prior to COVID, but COVID really sort of highlighted the vulnerability of our food system in a lot of ways. And so I think a couple of states were able, frankly, to move pretty quickly. I don't know what sort of the climate is for something like that in Alabama, but it'd certainly be something we would be willing to look into and see if there's any way to work on it in this state. Okay, while somebody else can please raise your hand, have comments, questions, but I'm just going to put my info. Oops, yeah, that will do it. My information into the chat. Anybody here doing poultry processing of any kind? Okay. Any other questions on FSMA or produce safety? We may be wrapping this one up just a tiny bit early today.
I'll just go ahead and plug something that we have coming up next week. You probably saw that FDA announced a proposed rule around the water regulations for the produce safety rule. And we're doing an informational webinar next Wednesday. I'll put the registration link in the chat. We just hope for farmers to gain awareness around this new proposed rule. They did remove the water testing requirements, which I think is really good news, but there's something else in place there too. So we'll do that. And then we'll also talk about how to comment on that rule if anyone so desires. So.
Wonderful. And do you know, Kristen, when the comments are due?
I don't. I will by next week, but it's usually like 90 days or something. So.
Yeah, I missed that they took the testing requirements out of FSMA. FSMA has not really been my strong suit of expertise, but I think I need to dig more into it. So I will do that. Somebody did raise a question here in the chat about the process for getting a mobile processing unit and what that looked like in Alabama. I don't know if folks can speak specifically to Alabama, but what I can say in general is that it kind of depends on what kind of mobile processing unit that you wish to do, right? And what I mean by that is you can have a mobile processing unit that is has a USDA inspector, so you can actually try to go through the USDA inspection route and have somebody come onto the site with the mobile processor and do inspections. In Alabama, you can have custom slaughter facilities, and they're regulated by the state. I believe it's the State Department of Agriculture that issues those licenses for custom slaughter facilities. So I think that's where I would start and just talk to them and find out if you could put together a mobile processing facility that would similarly get licensed by the state. It would be what I would do, but I don't know if you've seen any other specific, any specifics on mobile processing in Alabama.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, unless there are any other questions, yeah, I think we're at a good time to take a moment to pause. Thank you, Alexia, for being here.
Yeah, thanks so
been
much for
really
having me.
Yeah, I've learned a lot of stuff. For those of you who didn't see at the very beginning, of course, the session is being recorded and will be on YouTube later. So you'll get a link to it as a registrant. And so if you want to go back over anything, you'll be able to do that. So I can take a moment to thank Alexia for being here. If there's anything that really stood out to you during this session, I welcome you to include it in the chat or share it with me later if you like. I'm around. Thank you, Kristen, for sharing so many great information too. I appreciate you. I do want to take a second to plug ASAN as a member-led grassroots network. We are strengthening our collective muscles to address the most pressing challenges for farmers and aspiring farmers, including access to capital, access to land, and environmental threats. So there is a place for you in this movement. If you're not already a member, be a member today. Here is a link in the chat to where you can make that happen. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you all have an amazing day. Thank you.
Thank you all.